I'm speaking to you today from the heart of the Sorbonne, the greatest university in France. Behind me is the Church of Saint-Étienne. It's a living city, so we'll let this car pass. Saint-Étienne was built beginning in 1222, which is when the Sorbonne became a university. In the Middle Ages, Paris had been a trade city and a city known for its knowledge. And this whole hillside was a cluster of schools where people came to trade and to try to understand their religion. These schools cohered in 1222 as the Sorbonne, and behind me, this was the parish church associated with that transition. It's built in the Gothic style. You can see the large arches up at the top. By stretching the stone up high like that, the stress of the building could reach higher and higher and higher. The streets in this part of town are very, very curvy. Any of you who saw Les Miserables, the film, or who have read Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the book, know that the city is an important character in that book. This winding little pathways were viable as places to build barricades and resist the government. We're going to be talking about the boulevards of Paris, which are built following that period, following the period of Victor Hugo's book, and I hope you'll see how the city changed in that time. So surprisingly enough, this is the front of the same church. The parish church of Saint-Étienne got a facelift beginning in about 1700. Paris at that time had become so terribly overcrowded that there were cholera epidemics, mass uprisings because of food shortages. It was a very, very hard place to live. Part of how the monarchy addressed this overcrowding is it moved all of the courtiers to the Palace of Versailles, taking them out of the city and with them all of their craftsmen. Well, of course, that left the city beginning in about 1680 with a massive underclass, an underclass of people who no longer had access to the wealth of the aristocracy. So this church got a new face in 1700 in an attempt of the monarchy to reclaim the Catholic core of France and of the Sorbonne. Prior to that time, there had been relative tolerance. I say relative, not absolute, but relative tolerance of Protestants and Jews, in other words, non-Catholic people. But beginning in 1700, that's basically over. And as the monarchy becomes stronger and stronger, its Catholicism becomes stronger and stronger. So this facade in all its resplendent decorative glory, its high cost use of materials, is essentially making that point. You can see this in the very ornate use of surface decoration, right? The columns are decorated, the pediment, that's the triangle up there with Christ in majesty up there, and the top of the church, all of them very, very ornate. This was placed in front of or attached to that Gothic facade. Protestantism was officially abolished in 1680, so that was the exact date after which this newly formed or newly rediscovered Catholicism really took hold. I also meant to tell you that in the early 16th century, so about 100 years before all this happened, the size of Paris doubled in 20 years, from 200,000 to 400,000 people with no infrastructure. We're not going to have a chance to go to the Louvre today, but just as an illustration of what was happening in France at that time, the Louvre was a royal palace with a massive courtyard. And by 1780, the Louvre had been basically filled in, that courtyard had been filled in with a village, wall to wall for security. It was considered a nice place to live. So that whole courtyard of the Louvre was filled with common people, and the king made the decision to wipe it out. He just tore that whole village down. We're standing at the top of the Rue Soufflot. This street is named for the architect of the building behind me. This is the Pantheon. It stands on top of what was historically Sainte Geneviève. That's that first great church of the Sorbonne, the first great thinking center associated with this part of town. It's an emblem of enlightenment. If you look at the front of the building, you can see it's pared way back from that 18th century building that we saw behind, the facade of Saint-Étienne. Just that simple colonnade, those 6 columns, sort of legible from way down at the bottom of this hill. The Enlightenment was a movement associated with the rejection of religious feeling and the rejection of the constraints of monarchy. And the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment are buried in this building. Victor Hugo and Émile Zola, the greatest French writers of the 19th century, something which is debated, but essentially the great heroes of French writing from that time are buried inside this building. So here at the core of the Sorbonne, we have this testimonial to creativity and to critical Enlightenment thinking. You would want to juxtapose this to or measure it against the building that we just looked at, the 18th century homage to the French king. It's no coincidence that this building was finally completed in 1789, which is the year of the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of the French Revolution. I'm so glad we could be here when the Pantheon is under construction, because one of the points I want to make is that the city is alive. The same way that we had a Gothic church that had a 17th century facade, and we have this incredible example of Enlightenment architecture in the Pantheon. We have here behind me one of the great locations of creative endeavor in the 20th century. I won't spend much time on this, but this here, this Hôtel des Grands Hommes, is the place where André Breton and Philippe Soupeau invented what's called automatic writing. That is, trying to write directly from the gut without editing things that don't necessarily cohere in a rational way. So we have a challenge to the Enlightenment, a challenge to the rationality represented by the Pantheon, here embodied in a building directly across the street from it. So the entire city can be seen that way as places where one activity responds to another, whether it's in centuries past or centuries present or nearly present. I love this construction paper, and inside the building they actually have it all over the floor. You can see all the diversity of the people of France. You see people of every color and creed in this remarkable way that they've wrapped the dome while it's under construction, and I just love it. It's very, very effective. It's very moving inside the building to see this religious space essentially encapsulating all of the breadth that France has to offer. Oh, this is so much work. We began this talk with the tiny little medieval streets up at the top of the hill here by the Pantheon. In the second half of the 18th century, those streets were cleared away and Paris was redesigned by Baron Georges Haussmann under the orders of Napoleon III, that is, the grandson of the first Napoleon. The idea was to create a city that would be free of pestilence, that is, would not have the cholera outbreaks that were so epidemic for most of Paris's history. Another way to think of it is a city was created that was indefensible for uprising, right? You couldn't build a barricade across these wider boulevards. Everything about architecture was standardized from that point forward. Buildings couldn't be more than 4 stories high. This creates that drawing perspective, that thing that takes your eye right to the Pantheon and all the major sites of Paris. So now I'm waiting for the bus to take us over to see the Garnier Theater. And we will do that in a minute, but I thought you might like to see this incredible view of the market at the bus stop. Yves Chevelle and I are here taking a bus trip to go to the Garnier Opera. That's okay. It's fine. It's live TV. So this is where we're going to end our tour. This is Charles Garnier's incredible Paris Opera House, also part of the redesign of Paris under Napoleon III. And you have to remember what opera was at that time. Imagine a world without electronic audio or movies, right? The opera was a total experience, completely immersive with sound and sets and everything. This was the centerpiece of entertainment in the new Paris of the Second Empire. Its style is neoclassical, so you'll see echoes of that nice, crisp neoclassical style that we saw in the Pantheon. And you'll also see a lot of emphasis on ornament. You'll see the gold, the gilded elements that emphasize the wealth of this new city of light. We're going to end our tour here with probably the most famous single intersection of boulevards in all of Paris. Behind me is the Paris Opera, and all these boulevards come from across the city to Paris so that people could come here to be entertained. That would be the upper classes and the private galleries, and then down below the general public. Thanks for coming.